And against the background you have just heard, I'm going to be discussing with you gender transformative practice as it applies to the primary prevention of violence against women and girls. Now, gender transformation or gender transformative practice is a relatively new concept in the high-income countries, but a relatively practiced concept in many low-income countries. And when Nancy comes up, she'll be giving you some examples to illustrate that. But my task is, at this stage, just to explain how gender transformative thinking applies to violence against women. You've heard a lot of background from Lara about the link between rigid gender norms and violence. But gender transformative thinking requires that we think, as you have just seen, about many issues at the same time. And it means particularly that if we're trying to address violence against women, that in our actions we also have to think about addressing equity at the same time. And that sounds quite simple, but it's indeed a little harder than it sounds. Many of us are funded in silos or projects that have limits, that require indicators of success that are quite linear, and they don't often allow us to think this broadly. But in order to really solve issues as complicated as violence against women, this is a necessary perspective. And it means that you actually actively have to set dual or multiple goals, to actually create elements in your program that address multiple goals, that you measure additional indicators, or in some cases create indicators to measure the things that matter to the problem, such as violence against women. And at the end of the day, it means you have to focus on root solutions and really address root causes in so doing. This is a diagram that comes from some of the work we've done in creating training programs on gender transformative work. And it illustrates one main point at the bottom, that when we're in charge of creating programs or strategy documents, such as the ones you've heard about today, we actually have a choice. We have a choice to address gender at all, or we can be gender blind, as you see on the left-hand side. We have a choice to address gender in ways that are exploitative. In other words, they rely on negative and rigid gender stereotypes, or we can attempt to change those stereotypes. Or we can accommodate gender, which means we take gender into account and create programs that are sensitive and specific to, typically, males and females. Transforming gender, which is what I've just been talking about, where you actually change something in the equity frontier and actually address root causes and root solutions at the same time, is much more difficult. But the point of this picture is to say, number one, how are you doing in your work? And number two, how could you be doing more transformative work? I like to put this example up, not because Our Watch is hosting us today at all, but because this is one of the finest examples of gender transformative thinking in the violence against women field in the world. It makes an explicit link at the top, violence against women and gender inequality. So this is clear, it's courageous, it's not the typical approach to prevention of violence against women, and it's riveting. It makes you sit back and say, oh, so what would we do about it? And of course, the drivers and all the things that Laura has explained come into a very complicated response that stems from what is essentially a transformative approach. So gender inequity is still with us. Inequity in general is still with us. It's a global problem. It's pernicious. Even though many of us started working to raise awareness about violence against women 30 years ago or 40 years ago, in many ways, the examples that we hear in contemporary times are worse than ever. There are more of them, they're more explicit, more degrading, and On one hand, we can say, well, that's good, it's part of the global conversation. On the other hand, it makes you realize we haven't solved this problem by any stretch of the imagination. Root causes. This is linking directly rigid gender norms and partner violence and ill health. And this is important, but you can see this research is quite recent, 2015, and I think, as has been mentioned, some of the research making this link is also quite recent. So we do have, I think, a lot of work to do in creating gender transformative responses, but root causes is one of the big things. Gender inequity in context as well. Sometimes gender matters most and more, but there are lots of other factors that come into gender inequity. And as I like to say these days, way back, the terms sex and gender were often conflated in research and practice. And then we moved on to the point where more advocacy and science was being done to raise women's status, and gender and women were often conflated. But I think we're in an era now where we really have to take the lead in saying that everyone has gender of some kind, and everyone is part of a gendered group, whether they've been assigned to that group or whether they identify that way, and that gender is increasingly fluid and contested. So when we talk about gender transformative approaches, I think we have to bear in mind that there are many other elements, such as race, sexual orientation, age, and all that long list there, that are going to enhance the oppressions that lead to violence against women. And I think on the right-hand side, you'll see, this illustrates that very clearly. When we look at bullying in school, boys who are perceived as not masculine enough, girls who are perceived as not feminine enough, and girls whose bodies mature before their peers are three groups that are singled out for bullying. There are also lots and lots of pieces of evidence now linking bullying to the emergence of any kind of gender diverse identity, especially in adolescence. So what this all illustrates is that if you don't fit into the rigid boxes, and if you don't conform in some ways, out of your control most often, you are going to be policed. But the root causes are these, and we've sort of heard about them, but I think it's really worth taking up the courage and the clarity to name these things. The patriarchy is one of them, where there's these underlying assumptions that men have and deserve more power, resources, food, public space, ability to explain things to us, whatever, than women, and that boys are brought up in those traditions. And certainly the patriarchy takes many, many different forms. Some are overt, some aren't. But it behooves all of us to try and pick that apart. Heteronormativity is a similar kind of frame that in many cases is oppressive to people who are in any way a bit different or who want to live different kinds of lives. And the processes that fuel these frameworks are things like discrimination, racism, homophobia, marginalization, stigmatization, sexism, etc. There's a long list of fuel that feeds these two structures. And I put up an example here that we actually use in our book, Gender Unchained, that sometimes, as you may know if you follow the news in the USA, and to some extent in Canada, that being young, black, and male is very high risk in terms of exposure to police brutality, for example, or exposure to being suspected of crime and stalked unnecessarily on streets. So there are many different ways that these constellations of processes fit together and cause trouble for various genders, races, gendered races, and you can do the 2x2, the 3x3. So one of the things that I like to talk about a lot more now is if we all have some form of gender, and if we are committed to reducing inequity, we all matter at some point in this particular fight. And we all have a responsibility not only to talk about our experiences, to offer those, to make this picture more comprehensive, but also to take up some leadership roles in fixing it. And that, hopefully, will lead to more win-win-win situations as opposed to pitting males and females against each other in terms of resource allocation or political seats or any other kind of resource or benefit. So we all matter. We all matter in different ways, and all of us have things to gain by contributing that. Gender is, these days, a very fluid concept. And in many ways, this complicates the prevention of violence against women because it picks away at the containers of gender that are implied by focusing ourselves. And as much as violence is very gendered, and women are basically the victims more often than not, other kinds of gender expressions also attract violence. So we do need to take that into account and challenge ourselves with understanding various identities that go with various forms of gender identity and various experiences. But all of this requires some consciousness raising. It's an old term that needs reviving, and some critical thinking, so that all of us can in fact see what violence is, how it's perpetrated. And this little box is also from the book, illustrating how in some contexts where FGM is being fought, boys are more in favor of eliminating FGM than girls. Enough said about the kind of consciousness raising required. But back to the gendered quality of all of this. Many human resources, mostly, unfortunately, women and girls, are all of those things that I mention here, ranging from underemployed and underpaid to trafficked, assaulted, and murdered, and mutilated. It's a long and wide list, all linked. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot more about. 20 years ago, I led one of the first studies in Canada estimating the costs of violence against women and girls to the economy. And the figures that come out don't really matter so much as the concept. It really did attract a different lens to the problem, and I think we need to revive some of that thinking too. If gender inequity was resolved, we would have trillions and trillions more dollars in the global economy. And those estimates have been done by McKinsey and Company, for example. And there is just a list of ways in which human resources, mostly women and girls, have been abused or killed, and what some of the costs are, and the lack of return on investment. So money does matter. And I think it's worth saying that some of the more pernicious problems facing us these days need to have a gender lens and need to have gender inequity resolved in order to look more appropriately at things like poverty and sustainability and other wicked problems. So in closing, what we need, obviously, is some leadership and clarity, courage, some rethinking, and as I just mentioned, a linkage of violence against women and the prevention of it to some of the other wicked problems that face us globally. There are many examples of this kind of work and many new indicators that we need to be thinking about. In the blue and the purple, these are indicators that we've been constructing and trying to figure how they link to the drivers that Laura mentioned, in fact. And these need a lot more work to get these kinds of data sets in global data sets and in national data sets. So we'll move on now to the examples of gender transformative action.